Welcome to the Kawartha Small Business Podcast, where we believe the Kawarthas can be the most thriving region in Canada for small business. I am Brian Rump from Profit Coach.
And I'm Matt Garrity of Matty G Digital.
Alrighty, and today we are going to talk about paying for advice, something that everybody loves to do. What do you think about that statement?
Do they?
Yeah, I think they don't. That's why we're talking about it. But I think there can be benefits to paying for advice. And I guess we can just, in our conversation, walk through sort of why you would do it, when you would do that, who to look for. I think if the advice is good, it's usually worth, many, many times what you pay for it. But I think everyone is hesitant to, seek out somebody and pay them money for advice.
You know why? It's because how do we quantify if it was good advice or not?
Yeah, I think that it's hard because you're sort of going into a bit of a fog. You're not sure if it's good, and it's hard to immediately quantify that or know if it's good advice or not. I think for me, what's kind of cool about it is if you're a small business owner, at the end of the day, if it's your business, you are the one who has to make all of the decisions. So you need to, I think, get a lot of advice because you can't possibly know everything you need to know. You also don't know what the outcome will be on anything. You're taking a risk to be in business. If what you were doing, if there was a clear path to success, someone else probably would have already done it already. So your value is that you're the one sort of in that seat making those decisions.
Maybe that's what scares people away from asking for advice, where they realize, well, this is my decision in the end, anyways. Why do I need to pay someone else to give me the opportunity to answer it a certain way? And to your point, if people knew what the right answer was and if it was good advice, then they wouldn't have to ask for the advice. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, and I think there's just some paradigm shifts that have to happen. So one cool thing, question that I like to ask. So Matt, if you were facing the prospect of losing $100,000, how much would you pay me to not lose $100,000?
That's a good question. I don't know. Would I pay 10 grand, 90 grand? I don't know what that swing is.
Yeah. So the logical answer is basically, 999. Like if you're guaranteed to lose 100 grand, you know, you'd want to lose a bit less. So you'd pay anywhere in between there.
Yeah.
But I guess the way I look at it is um, there's got to be a number somewhere in there where you're going to test your decision making a little bit and try to, maybe convince somebody to test your decisions or test your bias or make sure that you're thinking of everything you need to think of so that your chances of losing that money are as little um, as possible.
And everything's an investment. Investments are investments. Marketing is an investment. Advice about anything, like nothing is set in stone. Anything you pay for is it's a bit of a test. I can't remember where we spoke about this now, but marketing is something that involves slowly improving month over month. You're not going to get it right the first month. You're going to be way further ahead than other people if you work with a marketing expert within that first month. But you don't know where it's going to go, and it's going to be something that you have to build to. And I think that maybe is the scariest part. I think it's really easy, and we do it all the time where we're like, pay for advice, go find an expert, pay for an expert. We will shout that from the rooftop forever. But I, it's tricky because like there's a trust factor with all of this with people, and I think that's probably the biggest challenge is, do I want to like build that trust with someone? Do I want to invest in that person, or do I just want to invest on my own path?
Yeah, yeah, it's a tough one. Couple things to break down there is, the trust factor and the right person. I think it's easier if you have a specific situation. So, example, in the accounting field, if you have a complicated tax situation, it makes sense to pay, say 10 grand for a tax expert who can then save you 100 grand. Like that's a no brainer. You can do that. When you're not sure what the outcome is, then it's hard to find the right person because there's a lot of people who are happy to sort of take your money and give you some advice, but they might not understand all of the context. They might not believe in your vision of what you're looking to do or understand what you're trying to do. So then you get sort of mediocre advice that's maybe not worth paying for.
It's tricky and it's such a slippery slope. Like, where do you go? Do you go to Google? Do you ask friends and family? And then at what, yeah, like who are you trusting with all this? I don't even think it's about the financial side of it the more that I think about it. I think people are more than willing to pay an expert or someone to do something. A lot of people like to hack it. A lot of people want to paint their own house, do their own roof, all those types of things. But where do you draw the line? I remember one time listening to stand up at it was like Yuck Yucks, did they call it in Ajax? Why am I good? Yeah, it's Yuck Yucks in Ajax, and there was this guy, and I'm not going to get the punchline right, but the whole gist of the bit was the internet has ruined DIY to the point where we think we can DIY anything. Like, why do we think that we can like re-roof our house on our own? Like, I'm just going to go online and watch a 10-minute video and then I'm going to learn how to do it myself with like a new roof. That's outrageous. And like, I think there's a lot to that.
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, people then, yeah, just not knowing when to seek advice, and I think there's some self awareness as well for someone's business of sort of what they're doing and at what point they do maybe stop and find that expert that is going to take a chance to go through a project with someone or test their thinking or help them out. Um, linked to what their goals are. One project I did several years ago now for somebody was they had a business idea. They were willing to invest. They sort of had a chunk of cash that they were about to put into a business venture. Before they did that, they paid me, it was like $5,000 just to like look into it and sort of lay out what they needed to know and find out like, hey, is this something I should do? And I just dug into a bunch of stuff, found a bunch of things that were sort of surprising, and essentially created a few pages of questions. And when they went through it, they were like, "Yep, nope, I'm not doing this." So like, basically, they paid that 5,000 or whatever that fee was. But then their chunk of cash they were going to put into a business, they realized they probably were going to just lose all of that in the end, and a lot of effort or the amount they thought they were investing. I think part of this was there was more layers to what they need to do to get it to the point where the business made money. It was an investment that was probably 3 or 4 times what they thought it was going to be. And they didn't want to just go down that road and get into that trap.
Wonder how many businesses would be more successful and not fail really quickly if those entrepreneurs paid for advice up front before they launched the business.
Yeah, I think it would be better. The other element of that is sometimes you need to like pay for the guy who's going to tell you why you shouldn't do that business. And then you're still the entrepreneur, you're making a bet. So there's no reason you have to listen to that advice, but at least you know what you're getting into and your eyes are open as to what all the challenges are going to be, versus being surprised all the time. I have an example. I won't share who it is, but it was somebody who was looking to buy a business. I was involved in some consulting. I connected them to somebody who they could have a conversation with. And I remember them saying, "Oh, we almost didn't go through with it because of talking to this person because they had had a bit of a rough experience. It was somebody in a similar industry in a different town.
Mm.
But then they really understood what the big challenges were going to be. Like, as soon as they took over that business, like there was some sort of harsh realities that were going to punch them in the face within the first 6 months. And then they were prepared for them all. And I was thinking about actually this business on the weekend, and I bet you it has to be worth 4 times what they bought it for. And this isn't even 10 years ago. Like at least their sales had, it's probably more, but it was such a good decision for them and sort of life changing. But part of that was they knew exactly what they were getting into.
Yeah, and one of the not a similar story, but ish, just paying for advice out of the gate before something was even real was when I was looking at places for Thrive, co-working community. And I was looking at like a few different spaces. Does it need to be ground floor downtown, outside the downtown like second level, all these different things. And then narrowed it down to one spot that I thought made sense, but also I was extremely scared of it because it's 2,000 square feet, which sounds like a lot, but from a co-working space perspective, it's not really actually. So I was a little bit nervous. Does this make sense? And I remember I sat down for like, I want to say 10 minutes total, trying to figure out what type of like blueprint type of software to download, trying to figure that out for free, like getting a free one. And then I was trying to figure out how to use this software, like make an office. Like I couldn't even figure out how to do like an office. And then I just was like, I don't even know how big an office is supposed to be. Like I have no idea about any of this. What am I doing? So I reached out to Home by Tim and Chris, designers out of Fenland Falls, and paid for their advice basically right out of the gate. And they ultimately did the design and the layout and the decor, like design and all that. But before I signed any sort of lease and got myself into like big trouble, I had them come down and like they did like a quick kind of mock up to measure like, does this make sense or not? Do these offices fit there? Can you actually fit X amount of offices in there where you'll get a return? How big is the co-working space in there? How big is the bathrooms? So I knew that I was going to maybe burn some money right out of the gate, a couple $1,000, a few $1,000s right out of the gate. But I knew that I had to have them on board to tell me specifically, like, is this space going to work or not?
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of, you know, potentially burning some money before you dive into something that may not work, right? Because a lot of people do that. They charge ahead, they'll dump, you know, sometimes I've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars into a project and they never thought beyond that. And then all of a sudden they're surprised or it doesn't work. Or if it was you, maybe you create offices that are too small or maybe worse, too big, right? And
Yeah.
people are like, I don't care about like a 20 by 20 office. Like I'm just a guy with a desk who wants it sometimes. So you pay somebody who knows current trends, pays attention to future trends, with designers, people who understand space and flow and design. You know, Another shout out to Tim and Chris. I've personally paid them to design some renovations for my house, and we haven't done any renovations. But I feel so much better having paid them for elements of the design because now we know what we want to do in the house, and like there's things they understand that I do not understand. There's things I would have done and spent money on that are probably completely useless. And then there's things that they've convinced me to spend money on that I think will make a big difference long term.
Yeah, it's fascinating, being able to do that, or it's almost the smarts to be able to do that right away and not get yourself in a massive hole. And I know a little bit about that story. I'm not going to go much more into it, but like once you figured out, okay, like this is what the kitchen is going to be like, and here's the cost, and then you start thinking about like, well, do I really want to go through all of that? And it was a good thing I only spent this to find out it was going to be this down the road. And then it's like, well, is that really necessary?
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting. have a similar one now. Actually, someone paying me for advice, and they are opening up and expanding a business and hiring people. And it's like we're going through what that looks like, what their volumes look like, and like, does it make sense for them to do that? And you know, one of the people involved was heavily involved in a business that failed before because they didn't think about those things in advance. They just went racing, and they only cared about a few metrics, and it ended up like they got squeezed out of the business, which happens with a lot of founders of businesses. They bring on investors, other people get involved, and then suddenly you're not even in your own business anymore, and it's still going and it's exciting, but you didn't think about different things along the way. And then you have to make all these sort of deals with the devil. Whereas if you understand a little bit more from the front, then that really helps optimize your investment.
Were you working with Ed Rogers?
Yeah, no.
Was that our first ever, or my first ever big city reference?
Yeah. Yeah, big city reference. Yeah, it's funny. Just the things that happen in the projects you get into. And, I think, for a small business, I think a lot of people think of wasting, a few $100s or even a few $1,000s as like a giant waste of money on advice. But I think, it's almost nothing in a way. You can get really good advice for hundreds or a few $1,000s, and it can help optimize your decisions so that you're not losing money. Or like we were talking sort of about avoiding the loss, but it can also help gain you a lot of money as well. I look at my background in grants, especially, and I love what I call $1 million conversations. And like you have $1 million conversation sometimes, and you make a few moves based on that, and you like can make a lot of money and sort of have a lot of sort of compounding success based on, a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s worth of advice.
Yeah. And another thing that just came up recently with Thrive co-working community specifically was the fact that we're hiring people for office coordinators. And I didn't even think twice about reaching out to an HR professional for that one as well. There was not a single moment where I was like, oh yeah, I can just put all of this together. Because I realized like there's very serious like legal ramifications for messing up HR stuff. And now just within this conversation made me think, I don't want to play this game, but what areas of experts and advice do you think are more necessary than others? It's probably all of them, right? But there's got to be some that are more important.
Yeah, I think it is a good question. I think the answer is always it depends. I think it's where you don't have skill. And even then, where you might have too much sort of blinders on, like get somebody to test you. I am available if anybody wants to pay me to fight them, essentially, and tell them what they're wrong, what they're missing, what their biases are. because people around you typically who want to encourage you, and your friends and family especially, they will not necessarily challenge you on stuff. They'll be like, oh, that's a good idea. And then when you flop, they're like, yeah, I knew that guy, that would fail. Like, it's like, why didn't you tell me that before? But I think, anywhere there's big liability or there's potential big um, dollars involved is where you want to pay for advice. So if you're getting, tax advice, HR and people, legal, if you're getting into an industry where there's like some liability you're trading, you definitely want to get some legal advice from the right person. Financial accounting is always sort of, worth its money. Even things like operations. There's people who work as consultants in like any industry. I know if you're a brewery and you want to set up a brewer or a brewery, like you can hire consultants that are going to help you source your materials, your equipment, like all of these things because they just know that industry really well. So that stuff's going to be worth it as well because you could get open, you know, say you open a month earlier, like the revenue you would get is, just massive. Like, time is money in a lot of these places. So having the right person on board is going to just help you so much.
And why do you think people are so hesitant to pay for advice then?
I think it's like a lot of things. I think at the core of it, a lot of people don't maybe have faith in themselves or their business, or they're hooked on a dream. And that's common too. It's like, I want to do this. It's my dream to do it. I don't want anyone to tell me it's not going to work or show me why it's not going to work. I think there's a lot of self awareness in facing those reasons why it won't work and then making your plan to get around them or saying, you know what, I'm going to, and this is common with a lot of small business entrepreneurs. It's like, yeah, that's a challenge, but you know what, I'm just going to outwork everyone and beat that obstacle. And I think that, makes sense. But I think sometimes people, yeah, they are hooked on that dream or that end vision, and they just don't want to face reality of the challenges that are going to get them there.
Yeah, you're right. And like you said about like friends and family, they're not really going to fight you. Most of them, I would assume, I don't know, I'm making massive assumptions at this point, probably don't have a clue about business, probably don't have their own business, probably don't have that experience. So you tell them they can't, not that you're going to argue with them or fight them, but they're not going to ask you any critical questions. Um, I always say this thing about my dad, like this is going to sound terrible, but like I never asked my dad about advice, like business advice specifically, because I learned this, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago. He'll never give unbiased advice. His advice is always, how do I protect my son?
Yeah.
And I like growing up, I finally figured that out. And I'm like, I know I can't utilize him for certain things because he'll be like, how about instead of opening up a co-working space, you don't, and then you quit all your other jobs that you've created and you just go work for someone. Like
Yeah.
that would be his advice. He's like, why don't you just settle down to a nice steady paycheck and
Yeah.
go from there,
Get
right?
a pension.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's yeah, and people are biased. They're also biased to their own investment things. One example would be, I know I can get on my soapbox about real estate. Is I've watched too many people's parents push them into, like, say, a business, and instead of testing it out first, they're like, oh well, buy a building, right? Because that's better, and then they stretch every possible resource they have to buy a building, and then they have no money to put in leasehold improvements or properly fund operations, or something like that. So they take someone else's bias about what is a good investment or what they should do and follow that, and that's not really what's right for their business either.
You're the one that talked me out of buying a building for Thrive. because I was, not that you talked me out of it, but I immediately went into it in that regard too, where it's like, oh, I got to own the building. Maybe this is like a real estate thing. And now people too are like, oh, you don't own the building. Oh, and they kind of like shudder. And now, like, I fully understand why I don't want to own the building. Owning a building is not like owning a house. Owning a house is a big enough pain in the butt. Owning a commercial building is a completely different situation.
It's a
Complete
different
nightmare.
business. Some people can do it and it makes sense for some. Other times, you have a landlord who's a professional commercial building owner and does all the headaches for that, and they're not, not a fat cat sort of like just sitting up in their palace. Like they're doing a lot of dirty work as part of that. So, it may make sense someday. Yeah, if it explodes and you want to own a building, then that's another decision for another time. But it shouldn't hold up what you're making, what you're doing now.
Yeah, like honestly, I don't know if I ever want to own a building. The more that I think about it in all these situations, like you have to have a ton of capital in case there's an issue, like if your roof is flooding, or like you've got issues. I don't want to have to deal with that. And good luck trying to sell that building after you do, depending on what you've got in there. It's like it might be all well and good if you owned a building and then you're like, hey, I'm going to put a commercial kitchen in and I'm going to open a restaurant. Well, good luck trying to sell that because now anyone that's going to go in there is just going to be a restaurant. You can't sell it for an office space or etc. You can, but it's not going to be as lucrative or exciting to the people that come in there. Like the commercial real estate situation is so much different than at home. And it's, anyways, that's a different conversation now.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, no. It also goes into structure and like it limits your buyers as well. Because if you're
Yeah.
like, oh, I want to sell this business, well, you better have someone who can also buy a building versus just buying, a business that maybe has a long-term lease and the building is, you know, tied up, which is pretty cool. But yeah, there's lots of ways to slice this. I'm glad we had this conversation about paying for advice, why people are hesitant to do it, why you should do it. Just a final thought. I think there is an element of, like with everything we talk about, people who are trying to start a business with literally nothing, like no money. In which case, like you got to dig up some money to invest in some things like this because your losses are even bigger. If you going in with something with no money and you're borrowing everything, then you probably even more so want to test your thinking and make sure that you're doing the right things so that you have a better chance at succeeding.
Yeah, I've always been a supporter for paying for advice, paying for an expert. Honestly, I don't know if you're ever going to be worse off from seeking out professional advice. You might not get the answer that you wanted, or it might not be presented in a way that you were expecting, but you are never going to be worse off paying for advice.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, with that, we'd like to work with you. So reach out. We're at kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca. We can help you start, grow, or recharge your business. You can also reach us by email at setitup@kawarthasmallbusinesspodcast.ca.